Our question for today's episode of the podcast is this: what in your life would you work for, sacrifice for, serve, and protect? And I think the answer to that is pretty straightforward. We would serve and protect and sacrifice for those things and people and critters, animals that we loved and cherished, that we related to and loved and cherished. And so the other question that goes along with this is, what if we were to widen our loving and cherishing boundaries, what we cherish and love? Wonder if we were to widen those boundaries beyond our closest loved humans and critters. In fact, beyond humans to the wider community of sacred beings and sacred elements that all living beings need to thrive. So that brings us to our theme, which is Poems for a Sacred Earth. Poems for a Sacred Earth, which also means you're listening to Poetry, Gossip, and the Pursuit of Pleasure podcast with Dale Byron. That's me. And this is a podcast where we explore the creative and practical ways of how poetry can help us in our everyday lives, as I always like to say, finding little pockets of joy, of sanity, and connectedness. So, just kind of teeing up our episode today, it seemed to me that the work of Martin Buber is really very relevant to our subject. And what I'm talking about is his notion of moving from an I-it orientation to an I-thou orientation. And that really says it all. Moving from an I-it orientation to an I-thou. And again, we're talking about not just with other human beings, of course, with other human beings and other critters and animals, but we're talking about with the earth itself, with Mother Earth itself. That's what we're talking about, changing the orientation. And some of the other notes I made for myself is that our orientation starts with the stories we tell, with our imprinting by culture, the poems we hear, the words and labels we use that either have us think of Earth as a living, thriving community of sacred beings and elements, as we're saying, or as nothing but natural resources, which is one of the worst terms I believe I've ever heard, or at least it ranks up there. And we'll talk about that more as we go along, because natural resources are to be used and abused and extracted, and all which that infers. So this week we're going to put in, as we say, a good word. We're going to put in a good word for Mother Earth. So let's get right in with the first poem, which is by a poet named David Oates, which I don't believe I've used any of his poetry. Brilliant poet from up in the Portland area in Oregon. And this particular poem, I think, fits with our theme today. And let's just do it. It's called Just Before Moonset. Just Before Moonset, Timberline. Timberline. And you know that timberline is that place on a mountain where above it there's not quite enough oxygen for at least the larger trees. So that's the timberline. Just Before Moonset, Timberline is the title of the poem. Waterfall, first line and first word. Waterfall in the night, rushes, rushes, stays. Waterfall in the night, rushes, rushes, stays. The sleeper, not far off, wakes to listen. Moon silver, star silver, granite, water. Around in slant shadow, unmade stones lie silent and untouched. Each in a perfect hollow of the close grasses. The sleeper sits stone-like. The sleeper sits stone-like, back to the westering moon, reasonless, real, reasonless, real. He will take no photographs. He will take no photographs. Even to describe it seems a falling away. The sleeper sits stone-like, back to the westering moon. Reasonless, reasonless, real. He will take no photographs. Even to describe it seems a falling away. Even to describe it seems a falling away. There's such great reverence for the natural world, for the sacred earth in that poem, I think. It's my feeling. And of course, I talked a little bit about natural resources. And again, I know that you hear that term all the time. But if you think about it, a resource, it infers so many things, that the resource is there for us. It's there for humans to extract and to exploit. And that is a different orientation, and one that we can no longer, in my humble opinion, afford if we are going to move forward in terms of coming back into balance with the natural world. And that is the subtext, of course, for this whole episode. But what's interesting is that when he says, the sleeper sits stone-like, back to the westering moon. I love that. Back to the westering moon. Reasonless, reasonless, real. We are so imbued, our intellectual selves, and using reason and being able to intellectualize and be able to use ideas. Wonderful, amazing. It's one of the things which makes humans so powerful and which makes humans human. And yet, if all we do is use reason, I've said this so many times before, we are bereft of a huge part of our humanity. And so when the protagonist in the poem says reasonless and yet real, reasonless, real, it's that something is real and valuable and even sacred beyond its value as a commodity, beyond its value as a natural resource. This poem, in a wonderful way, pushes up against that in a story form, which I think is so skillful. Now, I wanted to just say, by the way, that my wife, who is a brilliant photographer, would probably take issue with this line of he will take no photographs. Even to describe it seems a falling away. Well, we get the point. We get the point that to stop and to take photographs could be to turn it into an abstract piece of art, and that even to try to describe it beyond just the feeling of amazement and wonder is a falling away or a diminishing. However, I would say that maybe many people, and particularly my wife, again, who's a brilliant photographer, would likely say, no, taking photographs helps me deepen in the wonder. So that's possible as well. So let's keep on cooking. Remember our theme, poems for a sacred earth. And what we're really trying to do, as we've already said, is we're trying to imagine what are the stories. And remember, poems are just stories without the boring parts. And so what are the stories? And in this case, the stories hidden inside these poems that will help us move from an an I commodity, an I it relationship to an I thou, which is exactly what the name of the episode infers. A sacred relationship is an I thou. So let's move on to a poem by the poet William Stafford, who, if you've followed this podcast, you know I love. And also, like the former poet David Oates, grew up, I'm sorry, didn't grow up, but spent many years teaching right outside of Portland and lived in the Portland area for many, many years. This is a poem called The Well Rising. Very short poem, but I think it fits in our sacred earth poems. It goes like this. The well rising without sound, the spring on a hillside, the plowshare brimming through the deep ground, everywhere in the field. The sharp swallows in their swerve, flaring and hesitating, hunting for the final curve, coming closer and closer. The swallow heart from wing beat to wing beat, counseling decision, thunderous examples. I place my feet with care in such a world. I place my feet with care in such a world. Could there be a better description of a sacred world than to say, it is so, I have so much reverence and awe that I place my feet with care, as the poet William Stafford says through the protagonist in this poem. I place my feet with care in such a world. You know, I think there's so many images and they come at us so fast in this poem that by the time I get to the last stanza, I'm just kind of buffeted around in a wonderful way, almost like looking at that that we were talking about, where you look out at a landscape, you look at the ocean, you look at waves coming in, you look at a mountain, you look at rocks in a stream, a tree, a redwood tree, any of that. And that sort of way that it's almost dizzying, that you're getting feelings beyond reason, just that kind of visceral feeling that is so part of being human and is so joyful, so joyful. So when he gets there, he says, the swallow heart from wingbeat to wingbeat, counseling decision, thunderous examples. I place my feet with care in such a world. Beautiful. And we do have to make decision. And we do have to use our logical linear minds to help us understand how to experience the natural world, not as an enemy, not as something to be subdued and controlled and extracted from and dominated, but as a that as the context within which all life, including our lives, exists. It's the background, it's the ground of being, in other words, and it is sacred. If anything is sacred, the earth is sacred. Someone said, there's a author, a great book called Can Poetry Save the Earth by John Feldsteiner. And if poems, this is a quote, if poems touch our full humanness, can they quicken awareness and bolster respect for this ravaged, resilient earth we live on? So can they do something practical for us to help us in this ravaged, resilient, yet joyful and beautiful world that we live on? And this poem, The Well Rising, was one of the ones that the poet picked as a particularly important poem to use for just such a purpose. And I was thinking to myself as I was putting this episode together this last week, I was thinking, wouldn't it be great to read this poem at a hedge fund manager meeting? And then speaking of that, I had a few other thoughts. I'd love to read this poem to hedge fund managers. And then I wrote a little piece myself, which I want to bring to this episode because I think it's appropriate. And I would well, let's just let me read it first, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. It's called A Hedge Fund Manager Blessing. That's a mouthful. A hedge fund manager blessing. And this is a recent thing I've written, and it goes like this. To the nice young hedge fund manager, to the nice young hedge fund manager whose mom loves him and who received pretty good grades from a good university, who strategically decides to buy the company, who quickly loads the company up with debt, who then fires many of the employees, shipping their jobs to somewhere far, far away, where once before the people thrived, where once before the company thrived, who now abandons the town as well, who sells it all down the river in the name of a short termed efficiency, which is why I now give, which is why I now give a blessing, a new blessing, a fair set of rules for the road, they say, to your mind and stomach and heart. You can fill them all in another way. For the nice young hedge fund manager is no monster, is no monster, nor person of particular shame, but simply playing a slightly monstrous game. Let's run through that last part one more time. You can fill them all in another way. In other words, your mind and stomach and heart, all the things we need. We need to eat food. We need to have a sense of purpose. We need to have our heart touched. We need to feel like what we're doing is making a difference. So I'm saying that this new blessing to the hedge fund manager can do all that. You can fill them all in another way. For the nice young hedge fund manager is no monster, nor person of particular shame, but simply playing a slightly monstrous game. Now, when I first started writing this, I didn't really know where I was going to end up, which is for me always the joyful part of writing poetry. It's like an adventure. You don't know where you're going to end up. In fact, if you know where you're going to end up, you're almost always going to be writing some really bad doggerel. So you remember the poet who said, if the poet is not as surprised as the reader won't be surprised either. So, but one of the things that came to me, or an idea that was in the back of my mind before I wrote this particular little piece, was the fact that if we give people that we vehemently disagree with, and I vehemently disagree with hedge fund managers, which, buy companies, close them down, sell off the assets, fire all the employees, ship the jobs overseas, turn everything into commodity, to hell with the community where the company was. None of that matters. But what I'm saying is, rather than to make them into a villain, now I'm sure there might be some bad characters that are doing this kind of work, but that's not my assumption. My assumption is it's probably a nice young man or nice young woman, or older man or older woman, who's doing this work because they are caught in a context which says the way to win is to do all these things. The way to win is to not care about the externalities, how many lives may be wrecked, how many communities may be wrecked. But to win, you must just do the God of efficiency. You must do it like this and not care about any of the external damage, the unintended consequences. And so if we change the rules of the road, or if we change the substrate, I like to use that word these days, the substrate up underneath the rules of the game, in other words, then what we can do is we can shift it so that the way to win is not in these incredibly damaging ways, damaging to human beings, to animals, and to the natural world from which we all depend. So, this may not actually be, I thought to myself, a poem for a sacred earth, but it is a strategy that can help get us there. Because I do think this, the little note that I made for myself lately is no blame, no shame, just change. Because if we turn people into monsters and make it their personal fault rather than a system that they're operating in, then I think we're off to a wrong start from the very beginning, and probably will fail in trying to move things along. I heard a great interview by the environmentalist DJ White, who's been wildly successful in these environmental projects that he's done over his lifetime. And for example, he changed the entire tuna industry in terms of of not killing dolphins and preventing massive kill-offs of dolphins because of the way they were fishing for tuna. Now, he had to, in a way, befriend the enemy, as it were. But once you do that in a kind of Aikido way, as you blend so that you can connect and then have a real chance at making a change. Okay, so let's go on to another poem, which is this one's very unusual, and I'll tell you after I read it why it's very unusual. It's called Anacostia River, which is back on the East Coast near Washington, D.C. Anacostia River by L.J. Johnson. Okay, here's the poem. It goes like this. Just imagine waking up one day, looking out your window, starting to say, no bad smells, no smoke, no noise, no trash, no junk, no muddy waters. Just imagine the dead birds. Just imagine no dead birds because of, no dead trees because of, no dead people because of, no place to play because of. Be happy, be safe, and just imagine a kid living by the Anacostia River. Be happy, be safe, and just imagine a kid living by the Anacostia River. One of the reasons that I wanted to bring this poem for this episode is the unusualness, yes, of this poem. See, L.J. Johnson, when he wrote this poem, was 8 years old. 8 years old. And I can report that L.J. Johnson, this was in 2001, so he's now in his late 20s, I guess. Yeah, close to 30 or so. But he evolved into a poet, and I think he's quite successful. So that's all wonderful. But this was in his 8-year-old self. This is what he wrote. Just imagine waking up one day, looking out your window, starting to say, no bad smells, no smoke, no noise, no trash, no junk, no muddy waters. Just imagine no dead birds because of, no dead trees because of, no dead people because of, no place to play because of. Be happy, be safe, and just imagine a kid living by the Anacostia River. That is definitely a poem for the sacred earth. Definitely a poem for the sacred earth. And Uh, boy, you want to talk about what an 8-year-old can get, and how amazing, how amazing, how amazing. Okay, so we're heading for the barn now. Here's our last poem. Here is our last poem. And I want to, I wanted to bring this one. It's a relatively short poem. It's written by the great poet W.S. Merwin, who, by the way, for the last 30-ish years of his life, lived on Maui in the Hawaiian Islands and owned a kind of a rural farm, and he planted trees. That was his big thing, is planting native trees and just really nurturing and loving the land. And he was so connected with his work to the sacred earth. And he wrote this poem. And I hope you'll agree that it belongs in today's episode. It's called Place by W.S. Merwin. We just lost W.S. Merwin just a few years ago, by the way. Place. On the last day of the world, on the last day of the world, I would want to plant a tree. I would want to plant a tree. What for? What for? Well, not for the fruit, not for the fruit. The tree that bears the fruit is not the one that was planted. I want the tree that stands in the earth for the first time, for the first time. I want the tree that stands in the earth for the first time, with the sun already going down, and the water touching its roots in the earth full of the dead, and the clouds passing one by one over its leaves. I want the tree that stands in the earth for the first time, with the sun already going down, and the water touching its roots in the earth full of the dead, and the clouds passing one by one over its leaves, over its leaves. Here again is an amazing statement for the deep, intrinsic, sacred value of the living earth, all its animals, including its human animals. We are children of this earth, just like every other sentient being and every other sacred element, because none of us would be without the sacred elements. We, of course, and we all know this, science tells us this, each of our bodies is made of stardust and a combination of all of the elements here on this earth. So we would not be possible. The animals would not be possible without this living combination of living beings, plants, animals, and all inside and made through and through by the sacred elements of this earth, of this earth. In fact, that reminds me, someone once said, we don't live on the earth, we live in the earth. We are the earth. It's a different way to think about it, as all these poems give us a different, I think, and sacred way to think and feel and relate and see and understand the sacred earth that we all live in, not on, in. So that's a wrap. That's a wrap. And as I always say, I want to thank each and every one of you who've listened to this podcast in 2022, which is only a day or two away from flipping into 2023. I want to thank each of you for your listening ear and for your thoughts and for your questions and for your, yes, for being there, for being on this journey, on this poetic journey, this storied journey. Thank you so much. So, as I always like to say, until next time, in this case, next year, until next time, next year, and next poems, please, please take good care of yourself.